I welcome everybody to this panel as part of the Delphi Economic Forum. Our topic, going forwards or being held back, can the EU manage both solidarity and the turn towards illiberalism, contains many different elements. The panel is organised in collaboration with the London School of Economic European Institute and the Hellenic Observatory, and as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel. I will say something very briefly about the panelists. Danuta Hübner is a senior member of the European Parliament, very distinguished economist, as we all know. She used to be a Polish minister, she used to be a European commissioner, and I could go on and on with all the things that she's done over the years. Iain Krastev chairs the Centre for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. He is an eminent political scientist, I believe one of the founding members of the European Council for Foreign Relations, many books to his credit, and one of those is, I think, if I get the title correct, The Light That Failed, which is questioning where liberalism has gone in the EU. And more recently, he's been working on, he's published a book on the pandemic saying, is it tomorrow yet? The answer is probably not quite. Sonja Puntscher-Riekmann is an Austrian. But let's face it, she's also an Italian. She's an Italian at heart, and that's the reason I sometimes try to converse with her in Italian. She's a political scientist at the University of Salzburg, and she was the leader of a very significant European Commission project called EMU Choices on the future of economic and monetary union. And also a contributor to Altbach, where she's on the board, many, many other things. Loukas Tsoukalis is so many things, I don't have time to mention them all. He's the president of Hellenic, the Greek foundation. He's an author, academic, critic, frequent contributor to debates on the future of Europe, about which he's written many books. And I'm pleased also to welcome my colleague Kevin Featherstone, professor also at the European Institute. He was uncertain for a while, but he's been able to disentangle himself from all his other obligations, and he will be trying to conclude the meeting. What we have at the moment is a Europe beset by all kinds of difficulties. The pandemic, obviously, illiberalism, whatever that might mean, and we'll try to elucidate that, migration crises in the euro area, not an easy position at the moment. I don't want to say much more. I want to hand over to the panelists to introduce this better. And what we've agreed is that I'll pose an opening question to each of the panelists to enable them to say something on these topics. They will answer for around 4 minutes, and then we will move on to a more general discussion where we hope to tease out some of the high points of this discussion. Therefore, let me start with Danuta. Danuta, in a project syndicate piece that you wrote in 2017, you said that the challenge facing the EU today is to figure out how to re-engage with its backsliding member states, but without punishing voters for their leaders' misdeeds. Exactly how can this be achieved?
Yeah, well, we were at that time at a different stage of illiberal turn, as you mentioned in your title. I still would like to go to the title of the whole meeting, because I feel uncomfortable actually with this title, and I tell you why. And I think that Ivan might be against me, but I just would like to say that if you think of this illiberal turn or the turn toward illiberal democracy that we have in the European Union, there are people who see the roots of it in the deficiencies of the European Union as the whole vehicle that is supposed to ensure responses to the expectations and needs of citizens. And of course, EU has never been perfect on this, but there are also those who see the illiberal phenomenon as a designed product manufactured for the political use of certain politicians of the ilk of Orban, and there are more names, of course. And I think personally that we as the European Union, we were too quick in accepting this notion of illiberalism as a kind of legitimate description of something that really exists in the European Union as a kind of self-sustaining reality. And I think it is, it should be unmasked actually for what it really is, because I think that it is a political tool to seize reality and not to describe the reality. And as a manufactured idea, I think that it must be a passing phenomenon, because it is applicable to describe this moment, this fleeting moment between rejecting democracy and adopting a partial or full-scale authoritarianism. And that's why I would probably say that these are not democracies that have gone wrong. This is something very, very different. And I also think that we cannot expect that this moment will go and we will be back to democracy. It will not go this way. I think it has to be overturned by ballot boxes, and that's why I think that we should support as European Union and involve and look for instruments that would work as eye-opening exercise, as eye-opener also for the society. And I personally hope that Conference on the Future of Europe will be such an eye-opener. And that's why I think that the title, as I see it, is a certain generating kind of pessimistic reaction or pessimistic view is there, that this turn towards illiberalism in Europe will advance and we can only manage it. And I think this is a self-defeating proposition. We should manage the relations with those challenges to democracy like China, Brazil, or Russia, or Turkey. But within the EU, we are not supposed to manage it. I think we must just stop it. That's why I think the title should be How to Stop Illiberal Turn by Using the Solidarity Instruments. And that's what I think is we are having those instruments at our disposal. We must use them to get rid of this illiberal turn. And now I think just talking about what your question to me, I remember 15 years ago and a bit later as well, what was the Commission doing when we had in some, I will not use the name, southern countries in the European Union being too slow in their responses to calls coming from the Commission to be more efficient in spending, to do it faster, to do it correctly. And at that time, those countries did not threaten EU with abandoning European values like democracy or rule of law. Still, in the Commission, there were decisions made on millions and billions of euro that were suspended or cut off from the access for some member states. And today we have a much bigger threat, and we are not really able to stop it. We are not able to prevent it, even though we are having a lot of tools to penalize, to punish, to suspend, to cut off the assistance. And there are many calibrated tools within the cohesion policy, with this experience of cohesion policy. But still, of course, the EU is also using this discursive approach, which in some member states doesn't work, because you see dialogue, you see a situation getting worse, using this discursive approach when you see arrogance as a response and disrespect towards European institutions, where you see the judiciary system is weakened basically on a daily basis. You see the defenestration of public sphere, of all the freedoms. That means that we should continue this discursive system and dialogue should continue, but we clearly see that we are not using the instruments efficiently today. So in reality, I think we have to think why it's like this. And in my view, we cannot ignore the fact that politicians react exclusively to the voters. And that's why the only way for me to go today is engaging as much as possible, people, citizens, the so-called stakeholders, as you know, with different policies, we use this horrible language, to engage them in controlling political forces in power. And there is, I think, a growing evidence of readiness, of preparedness of people to get engaged and to get involved together with all the available instruments and with discursive action of the Commission. So we should more generously simply add to the government layer of governance the layer of real beneficiaries and victims of political arrogance of the governments, and engage them more on the basis of ownership principle. This is not a novelty. We have been always doing it, but not sufficiently, I think. And this is my first point. And second point, so use people. And secondly, use conditionality more efficiently. And I am sure Sonja will be talking about the new generation EU. And this is exactly going in this direction. Conditionality, not only as we had it so far, so at the last stage, but the conditionality, at the very initial stage, but the conditionality going through entire system from ex ante, before the program, through everything that the Recovery and Resolution Fund is offering in terms of conditionality, and then also in the implementation period. So we have to use this whole space that we have for the engagement of stakeholders, and reduce the space for misusing the funding, for departing from commitment, for departing from the values. I think we can do it through this approach, which I already see present in the new generation EU approach. So I would just maybe finish with this.
Thank you very much, Danuta. Very interesting comments. And you've raised the question of how to deal with illiberalism. Can I turn now to Iain, and maybe as a point of background on this, say that with the demise of Trump, Erdogan in difficulty, my question to you is illiberalism a growing threat to the values and political integrity of the EU, or should we view it as a phenomenon likely to fade away rather than persevere?
Listen, it's not simply going to fade away, but I very much agree with Danuta that we are at the end of a certain political cycle. And illiberalism was a very important part of it, at least in Central and Eastern Europe. But the liberal governments in the region, by the way, the populist opposition outside of the region, they didn't have a good COVID-19 crisis. And there's several reasons for this. One is basically, if you're going to see the performance of governments like Poland or Hungary in the moment of the crisis, you're going to see that they were great fighting the enemies that they have created for themselves, but when the real crisis came, they were not particularly efficient. And this is going to have an impact on how the voters are going to vote. Secondly, also, I do believe it's quite important to see that migration was critically important as an issue that gave a certain type of advantages and identity for this type of illiberal political parties and leaders. And as a result of the COVID-19, at least for the moment, it looks like the problem of the migration disappeared. Even more, basically, what you see on the external borders of the European Union was what all these people have been wanting to happen. You have a closed borders now because of the pandemic. I'm saying this because from this point of view, I do believe European Union, and particularly the German presidency, was right in one thing. They were not so much fearing what is going to happen in countries like Hungary and Poland, where you have illiberal governments in power. They were very much fearing what is going to be the economic impact of the crisis for societies in which the populists can come to power. And this is why spending quickly the money and basically trying to prevent a major economic crisis that can fuel certain type of anger among the population, in my view, was the right priority. At the same time, I do believe European Union started to do things that it was not doing before. For example, you see just 3 months before the Czech elections, you have from the Commission basically a clear declaration that there is a conflict of interest in the case of Prime Minister Babiš. This type of a very clear political signal to your country on the eve of the elections, we have never seen before. So as a result of it, my feeling is that the Commission was right to understand that the most important is economic stabilization of Europe as a whole, and the fear that if there are going to be a next deep economic crisis, these can create kind of conditions for a different type of a populist wave. And in my view, also, they were right to understand that basically the illiberal kind of a resentment in Central and Eastern Europe has peaked. And now you're going to see something that I'm going to call a post-populist publics. This is true for Poland, but even this is true for Hungary. I have been reading quite a lot of opinion polls recently. Mr. Orban is much weaker than many people expect on the basis of what you're seeing on the polls. And from this point of view, I really do believe we should see this political cycle as ending in a year or two. How the post-populist Central Europe is going to look like is a next and very interesting question. And from this point of view, looking at places like Slovakia and others is going to be quite informative. But this is an issue. The other part of the story is that even if some governments are going to lose power, at least in the case of Hungary, they managed to privatize the state to the extent that for new governments in power it's going to be very difficult to come back and to function in the way the European Union supposed them to function. And secondly, there is a high risk that in this situation, some of these governments will try to block certain European decisions in order to be sure that the pressure on them are going to be reduced. We already see basically Hungary blocking a common position on China. So I do believe this is the new reality, but in my view, we are seeing the end of a political cycle, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, and this was the cycle which brought to power some of these illiberal governments.
All right, thank you, Ivan. Sonja, both speakers have mentioned next generation EU. We see it in some circles as being a very positive development. But let me pose this question to you. Are those who see the agreement on the next generation EU recovery package as signaling a new spirit of solidarity among member states deluding themselves? You can speak either as an Austrian or as an Italian.
Let me speak as a political scientist first, and yes, I will relate to both countries. I would simply answer with a no. They're not deluding themselves as long as they have an appropriate understanding of what solidarity actually is. Of course, if you think of solidarity as a spontaneous, emphatic feeling of love towards your fellow citizens, then you're probably not on the right track. Solidarity is also in national context something born out of a common awareness of a given danger or risk. And that said, and I could go into this at length, but what we see in Europe is that gradually something like solidarity in view of crisis has emerged. It has done so in the financial and fiscal crisis. Interestingly, with regard to Brexit, where we saw the EU 27 keeping together in spite of all odds. Our colleague Bridget Laffan has written a beautiful article on this. And it seems to hold also in the COVID crisis. It did not so, and this is the big exception, in the refugee crisis. We have talked about this beforehand. The refugee crisis is a very special case, and there was little or no solidarity in that. However, whether this is going to stay and whether this will become a solid block of European joint policy making is another question. And because what you need is a shared definition of the crisis, first, and second, or a shared definition of solutions. what we have seen also in the financial and fiscal crisis, it took quite some time to come to a common definition of what was the source of the crisis, and you still had an enormous exercise of blame shifting and mutual recriminations. I'm not neglecting that, but in the end, a decision was taken and a number of shared solutions came up against what many have said. Just think of the literature about the euro is going to fail, to disappear. This is the end of EMU. But what it also engendered is a division between North-South, more than between East and West, but in particular between the so-called frugals that formed a bloc against the so-called profligans, or as has been said also by Kevin Featherstone in one of his publications, the sinners against the saints and vice versa. And what we have seen coming back also in the negotiations of the recovery plans for COVID is indeed this block formation of the frugals, which have grown, and also Austria is now part of these frugals, against the others. And in the negotiations, you had this rather ugly, I would say, bickering about the capacity of the EU to borrow money. And here the general framing or the general discourse is still, this is just a one-off, so don't worry, it will not come back in future, and in the future as a permanent capacity of the EU. So you still have this attempt to downplay what has actually happened. And the other controversy was, of course, about how much transfers will happen in forms of loans or in forms of grants. And here I would say, again, the frugals have been rather successful, first of all, in limiting the amounts that are to be transferred in grants instead of loans. But, and all this, and here I come back to what has been said by Danuta as well as Iain, the frugals have sold their negotiation success onto their publics in a very populist way. And it was Chancellor Kurz to step up in his rhetoric, saying that it was absolutely necessary to limit the grant part of the recovery plan, because this money would in particular be distributed to Italy, Italy being the great winner in these distribution plans, and that means to bolster wrong policies in a broken state. So we will see a lot of this rhetoric going on, but for me, it also remains there has been a decision. We do now have this borrowing capacity, and we have a mix of grants and loans. What is interesting, though, is that these very critical discourse between frugals and non-frugals, let's put it like that, does indeed undergo political cycles, as Iain has just pointed out. And one of the most interesting cases is certainly Italy, with now Mario Draghi at the head of the government. Of course, there are great expectations in regard to him, but with the support of the Lega, of Salvini. So this populist angle has been reduced. You have a similar development also in France and in other countries. Just think of the Polish finance minister, if I recall this well, saying that for Poland it would be suicidal not to ratify the recovery plan. Of course, we will see what comes out and whether the peace will be happy to be supported by the opposition. But nonetheless, also within the government, you have this move away from a staunch populist, illiberal position, at least with regard to the money to be distributed from the EU. And insofar, I endorse Danuta very vehemently to say that conditionality is key, whether we will continue on a liberal path or not. Yes, I will finish
Can I stop you
here.
there, please?
Pardon?
So if you could finish quickly, please.
Yeah. I'm finished here. I think we are not deluded, but whether this will hold in a medium longer run is, of course, an open question for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonja. Loukas, the three previous speakers in different ways have alluded to differences in parts of the EU. So let me pose this question to you so you can bring in your perspective. In both economic and political terms, the EU seems to become more polarized. Maybe one bloc in the northwest, another in the south, and a third very loosely called central and east. I know we can quibble with these separations, but how dangerous are these cleavages for the future of Europe? Can they be mitigated?
Okay, now I believe that one of the key factors for the success of the European project for decades was the fact or the perception that European integration was acting as a convergence machine, which enabled the less developed countries and regions of the European community and then the European Union to gradually catch up with the more developed ones. And this was crucial, and it lasted for decades. Unfortunately, EU as a convergence machine is no longer, and hasn't been for several years. And there's a variety of reasons that may help to explain why this has been so. I believe because the time is limited, it has to do, of course, with the liberal version of globalization that we lived through for the last 30 years or so. It also has to do with the latest rounds of enlargement, which brought in the European Union countries that relied heavily on low labor costs, flexible labor markets, and low taxation as means of the catching up, the economic catching up process. And this gradually created, and last but not least, the financial crisis. Because it was the financial crisis that slowed down growth, or rather created negative rates of growth for several years. And on top of it, increased the gap, especially between the North and the South. So indeed, we have experienced splits inside the European Union more than before. There is a North-South split in economic terms. There has been an East-West split, which is more, rather, as you pointed out, Central Eastern Europe versus Northwestern Europe in political and cultural terms. And these are challenges that the European Union has to deal with. Now, Sonja mentioned the European Recovery Fund. This is indeed a game changer, because faced with a pandemic, which is an even bigger problem than the financial crisis in many ways, and different in its own way, the European Union has done what precisely it had refused or was unable to do with the financial crisis, namely to partially neutralize debt, to launch a big investment program with a strong redistributive bias in favor of countries with weaker economies and economies that have been worst hit by the pandemic. So in that respect, the Recovery Fund is a game changer. Now, of course, everything will depend from now on implementation. And this has two stages. The first is that, as we again observe, painfully observe, the European Union may be extremely resilient. It has shown this faced with successive crises, but it is extremely, painfully slow in reaching decisions and implementing them. And then the second stage will be when we move from EU decisions to national plans. So the success of Italy, Greece, Bulgaria, and other countries to implement effectively those recovery programs and use those programs to gradually transform their economies will be the test as to whether this will be a one-off exercise or will be repeated in the future. Because, of course, if it fails, it will give huge opportunities for frugals and others to say, this is a waste of time and money. And perhaps one last word on illiberalism. There, I believe that the European Union should be much more decisive and firm than it has been until now. I mean, tolerating Orban and his relatives for so many years, especially within the European People's Party family, has been too much of a bad thing. And I hope that we have learned lessons from the experience until now. I will stop here.
Okay, thank you, Luca. I think you've all raised a number of interesting points, and I'm going to throw at you a question which I saw in the title of somebody else's seminar today. I won't reveal who it was, but that question is, can our faith in democracy survive the pandemic? Ivan, let me start with you on that.
Listen, one of the interesting story about the pandemic is that if you're going to try to define and to predict what is going to be the decision of the governments, be economic or on lockdown and so on the nature of the regime, you're going to be surprised that it is not going to work. Globally, basically, if I'm going to come and to tell you what certain governments did in order to fight the pandemic, you're not going easily to understand which of this government is democratic or non-democratic one. Secondly, also the type of government, the type of regime is not going to predict who is going to vaccinate better, nor basically who is going to share their vaccines with others. So from this point of view, I do believe that the Cambridge political scientist David Runciman was right, saying that in the moment of crisis like this, basically democratic governments are showing what they have in common with any other governments. Basically, they're focused on order. So this is not at the same time to claim that as a result of this crisis, basically our society starts dreaming about any type of authoritarian regimes. And particularly in Europe, I don't see it. It's probably very different in Africa and other places. And of course, there is a quite strong disappointment with the performance of democratic governments. I was reading recently certain opinion polls about France. And this is really shocking. How angry and disappointed a lot of French, both on the left and on the right, is also the state of the political system. But I don't believe that basically there is an authoritarian temptation in Europe. We have something totally different. People are pushing for a different type of democracy. They're pushing for certain type of a much more competent type of democracy. Not that they exactly know very much what they want. And here comes the problem of speed of decision-making, which is critically important. And here is where the European Union, in a certain way, is in a very difficult position. And this is institutional. It's not simply the risk-averse culture, which is also part of what Europe is today. And the story can be very much seen at the very moment when, probably rightly, the Commission and President von der Leyen decided to take the leading position on supplying with the vaccines. And here you can see how difficult it is, basically, for European Commission to act as a normal government. Compare basically with what happened in Israel. In Israel, basically, the major story was, I'm not interested how much it costs. The only thing that interests me is to have them quickly. I'm ready to give all the data which the pharmaceutical companies needs in order to make a priority out of my demand. And I want to be really re-elected. And basically all my success depends on how quickly and how many people I'm going to vaccinate. On the side of Europe, we are pushing people to come with the best price. We are coming with a situation in which we try all the time to balance between the interests of the different European companies, be French, be Germans. And thirdly, you're buying and supplying the vaccines, but they're the national governments which are implementing. And if something goes wrong on the national side always very easily can blame the Brussels for what is going on. So I do believe that the problem of speed and how democracies can stop to be so painfully slow, something that Loukas is saying about, is going to be critically important. Because what really I fear is the following: in October, suddenly Europeans are going to realize that countries like the United Kingdom or the United States, that we were shocked to see how they underperformed during the initial months of the crisis, got a better position to go to economic normalization. They're going to be much more vaccinated in a certain way. The stimulus that was put, particularly in the United States, was much more ambitious than what we're seeing in Europe. And if basically these countries, and I'm even not talking about China and others, are going to look much more dynamic, this is going to erode a kind of a trust, not in a democracy as a type of regime, but in a type of democracy and the type of democratic Europe that we have at the moment. But my feeling is that as a result of this crisis, people probably are disappointed what was they got. I don't have the feeling that Europeans are dreaming about China and the Chinese way of life and governance.
Sonja, what do you feel on this? Are you fearful about what might happen, for example, in France?
Well, generally, I would just continue where Iain has left off. I also don't think that we are on a road or a path towards Chinese situation. However, what this pandemic has shown is that you need to be prepared for such crisis. And I'm quite astonished which national health system is working well, also independently of a government. And that is what you, Iain, said before we entered this discussion about the national health system in the UK. If I compare this with the Austrian one, which is an excellent health system, but obviously very impaired in setting up speedy logistics for the vaccination. And this has a lot to do with not being able to share data, in particular personal data, between the different institutions. So I also seconding Ivan, it's not only the very difficult and slow decision-making processes at the EU level, but also at some national levels. And just think of the difficulties of the German Federation to come to a joint effort in the vaccination issue that would cover the whole of Germany. But I wonder whether
not to dwell too much
Pardon?
on COVID responses, but to think more generally about the impact on democracy.
Yeah, but this, if what Ivan said is correct, and I think he's correct, that the lack of speed in deciding and putting in place a system affects the vision of normal citizens on democracy and becoming and fostering their criticism about this is perhaps something which needs to be mentioned. However, and this is my last remark on this, what astonishes me in the public debate is that indeed, while people are very critical about their governments and dream a sort of at least Roman dictatorship to solve the crisis. By Roman, I mean that it has all to be over after a very well-defined period of time. They are rather inconclusive when you ask them, but what do you actually want in terms of democratic reforms? And here I would say what makes me nervous is the critical view on representative democracy and a very, let's say, warm welcome to more plebiscitarian forms of democracy. And I think that a modern world does need a well-functioning system of representative democracy. So the skepticism towards parties and their maneuvering in elections and setting up of governments is a position that does not really, or is not really able to say, but what else would then function in a modern system of governance? So it's coming out of their guts, but not in a well-reflected way.
Danuta, in Ivan's initial remarks, he referred to what you might be called post-populism. Do you have a sense of what post-populism might mean, in particular for your home country?
You know, first of all, I would like to say that the situation is different in the societies that entered and have been through the pandemic-induced general crisis is probably different from many other countries. So I think that if you look at countries like Poland or Hungary, I very much share, I think, even judgment as well, that all those I think para-dictators or dictators would to be that they were just developing all sorts of activities to keep their politically and economically corrupted regimes in power. I think those guys have been losing, I think, over the pandemic years. And in those countries, I think the appetite for democracy has started to grow, I think, and the understanding that they are not living in the framework of what they have been waiting for so many decades, which is the democratic framework. So in these countries, I think the situation is rather changing, and we might see not so much open space, not so big space to be open for new populism or post-populism there, I think. So that's the unhappiness with the way our democracies or our reality, the governments or European level worked, the speed, the lack of responses or not sufficient responses. This might have still opened some space for new populism in those other countries. I guess that's my worry, that again we will be in an equal situation across Europe. I'm not talking about the global challenges to democracy. But at the same time, as Sonja mentioned, we have, I think, because of the pandemic, I think, you know, in the crisis, people they just want to talk, they want to give opinions, they want to also reflect on their future. So I think we have a certain change, a certain openness also to this I would call it participatory democracy or deliberative democracy, and which, depending on situation, which might be simply a support coming from below for representative democracy. It doesn't necessarily mean certain sort of across Europe a victory of participatory democracy. I don't believe in it, but I believe that we can see the support for democracy and representative democracy coming exactly from those movements being born below, on the bottom, through the changes among societies and the expectations of people. So I think again we will have this might have this diverging situation that, or maybe the cycle is just sort of not synchronized well across Europe, that we might have more risks and more threats in other societies, other countries. So we have to be certainly vigilant, and that puts a lot of burden also on the Commission. But I would also like to go to. I'm sorry, I'm probably making your life as moderator difficult, but I think there was a lot of very important issues mentioned also by Loukas and by Sonja, in addition to democracy, on those issues related to the current period of the reforms in the European Union. And I don't know if you envisage also the exchange on this, Iain, or you still want to talk about the democracy? Because
Well,
I would
we
like
can certainly
to shift also to other comments. Mm-hmm.
We can certainly move on to that, but let me not neglect Luca, because there's something else I want to bring into the entire story, and that is what we mean by solidarity. There's been a lot of discussion about whether solidarity means what's going on with Next Generation EU, but Luca, you also have incisive ideas on these things. What do you understand by solidarity, and where is it going at European level?
Well, of course, solidarity within an established nation state is different from the solidarity you can look forward to having inside the European Union. It is not automatically obvious that the inhabitant of Lapland feels a strong sense of solidarity with the inhabitant of southern Peloponnese or Sicily, all right? So it's something that you gradually work on and build up. So my emphasis very often would be not entirely on solidarity, but on long-term, benign self-interest. It is, let me give you an example. Of course, the Greeks bear an important part of responsibility for the mess they found themselves in after the outbreak of the financial crisis. But to pretend that the crisis of the euro only had to do with fiscal irresponsibility in Greece, for example, led you nowhere, because it was not true. There were systemic weaknesses in the Eurozone. There were responsibilities of banks. There were current account imbalances, which were also important in trying to understand what was going on. So when appealing to the Germans, for example, let me name countries by name, I will not only talk about the need to express solidarity vis-à-vis the embattled South, but also remind the Germans that Germany is by far the biggest beneficiary of the operation of the European Currency Union. And they have an interest in defending it and sometimes using part of the German purse to support it in exchange for other benefits they receive. So I think that appealing to the long-term self-interest of countries may be more effective than simply referring to solidarity. The world is like this.
You remind me of Benjamin Franklin's famous saying, we must hang together, because if we don't, we shall most certainly hang separately. Danuta, do you want to come back in on the question of economic
Yes.
reforms then?
Still on solidarity, I'm sorry, because I agree and I disagree with Loukas. I think we cannot miss one point I think in the last year and the COVID.
Disagreement is important in this panel.
Yeah, I think because, you know, solidarity, I share very much what Sonja said, that it's just this common awareness of risk now, and the common awareness, common understanding, which has increased dramatically, I must say, that we need actions on European level, that there are more and more issues that are, or challenges that are not respecting any national borders, and that we had a big problem with communication across Europe. In many societies, they had no idea that Europe is doing anything at all. But I think we have moved, I think, finally to a situation where people individually, and that translates into, I think, a bigger issue, people individually see how much they depend also on others, that it was a simple thing, that it's not only you who have to make tests or have the masks, and but it's also you depend on all the rest of the crowd in which you live. And I think this is an important transformation, I would say, in the perception by the individuals of their belonging to the global world or the European world or the local community as well. And I think this is also translating into the expectations, I think, towards politicians. So I really hope that the next elections will not be against the democratic regimes and will not be in favor of those who created a liberal democracy system. So on solidarity, I think it's very important. But in the context of the new generation EU, I think we are not yet there. I think that this is really an example, I think, of a modern new understanding or non-traditional expression of solidarity. I think the whole new generation EU. But if you listen to the debate in the context of the national ratifications of the decision on the own resources, which most people see as ratification of the Recovery and Resilience Fund, it's shocking what is the discussion in Germany when you think when you see that the issue which is very important is whether Germany at the end of the day will have to pay for everybody to repay the debt, because the assumption is that nobody will be willing to repay the debt. And this is something which, when I for the first time participated in such a panel, I couldn't believe I'm hearing this, but this is a serious concern. So I think there is somewhere a problem in the European Union that this solidarity is still seen as not in our own interest by everybody, but is seen as, again, something like the transfer union. And I was so happy that we are moving to the reform in the European Union through action, simply because reality puts on us this necessity to start reforming and to think of the bonds, euro bonds, and safe assets and many other things. But all of a sudden we see that there are still...
I have to stop you because we're running out of time. So a very quick last
word. I just
want
wanted to say that it's surprising, yes, that solidarity is not everywhere.
Right, well, I've been warned by the organisers that we have only a few minutes left. So can I pose one last question to each of you and ask you to confine your answer to exactly 1 minute so that Kevin has some time to sum up at the end? My question, let me start with Iain on this one, is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of Europe?
Listen, this is the question that, being Bulgarian, I really hate. First of all, but there is something very common between optimists and pessimists, and they pretend to know that how the future is going to look like. So I prefer to be hopeful. For example, coming from where I'm coming, basically being pessimistic means being fatalistic. So I don't want to be in this. But optimism cannot be substituted for the fact that the European Union should take some tough decisions and should decide on many things, including the speed of the decision-making.
Sonja.
Let me quote somebody who is quoted less and less these days, and that is Antonio Gramsci. who coined the notion of energetic pessimism. And that is actually what I would like to indulge in, energetic pessimism. We don't know what comes out of all these actions we take, but as long as we keep the energy to pursuing the goals we set, I think things cannot really go totally wrong.
That's an encouraging statement.
Enough?
I'd regard that as optimism. Luca, is it a sunny day where you are, or a rainy day?
It is a funny day, but the experience of recent years tells me two things. The European Union is remarkably resilient. So people who keep predicting the demise of the European project keep on discovering that they're wrong. So the Union is resilient, but it is extremely slow in delivering the goods. And my fear is that the world may not be willing to wait for us to make up our minds. And that is the biggest risk.
Danuta, your minute.
You know, we are condemned, I think, to be successful in what we have to do. And I think we are, first of all, fully aware of what we have to do. And a lot of investment in resilience that Loukas just mentioned has been done over the recent months. And if you look at the work of the European Commission, also the Parliament, I think that we will continue with huge energy the reforms and building further resilience. But the most important is the second thing, which I already tried to mention before, which is that people finally are getting engaged in discussing the future and shaping the future. If you look at what were the topics when people went to the streets in Poland, for example, I think a lot of that is depending on Europe, on the future of Europe. So I trust that this combination of commitment to reforms and energy at the institutional and government level and the people's engagement, that gives a good combination that I think makes me feel realistically optimistic, but a lot of effort is needed, but we have no other option, I think.
Right, Kevin, I'm going to hand over to you to, if possible, sum up what you've been hearing and tell our listeners and viewers what messages you take from this panel.
Well, thank you. It's clearly a huge agenda, and we've actually had a very rich discussion in a very short period of time. I think what I take from this is that there were ongoing systemic issues for the European Union, which have merely been intensified over the last year with the COVID crisis. It's broadened the agenda on the theme of conditionality, which was raised by each of the members of the panel. But it highlights the risks of implementation and the risks of failure. So the systemic problems are not new, but they've been deepened and intensified. Danuta and Sonja were talking about the need to make conditionality more effective, conditionality being key. But if the EU is to return to be the convergence machine that Loukas mentioned, it clearly needs to acquire more of the features of an effective political system. And we can think of some of the issues which linger. The European Commission is asked to monitor, to report on different aspects. Its rule of law report, its reports on anti-corruption, its reports on conflicts of interest, as with more recently Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic, etc. But there's a systemic issue there. If the European Commission is left to report and be a paper tiger, if it can't actually follow through with effective action. And there's a further issue then in terms of conditionality more broadly. How can the European Union not only monitor, but make domestic intervention the requirements, the instruments of conditionality? And there, again, on a long-term basis, there are the deeper unresolved questions of legitimacy and accountability. in a multi-level system, which would only become more acute as the European Union moves forward. So I take from the discussion also a unresolved question about the limits of carrots and sticks that the European Union might be able to use. I think Danuta talked about needing to make the instruments of conditionality more effective. Well, what are those limits to the carrots or the sticks that the European Union may have in its armory? So I think we are at a defining moment. I took from Ivan the optimism that the current illiberal turn and the turn towards populism may fade away. I hope his optimism is well placed, but I think there is sufficient concern that it may not be fading away so quickly. In which case, as Loukas has mentioned, or implied, the European Union lives through a history of so-called pivotal moments. I think what's different about this particular pivotal moment is that it has such a strong normative aspect. It's not simply a matter of what the European Union should do strategically, but it's also a question of the European Union being challenged to what it stands for. And if it can't actually deliver on its values, if it can't deliver on a common notion of solidarity, if it can't deliver on questions of rule of law or crony capitalism involving governmental leaders, as in the Czech Republic, if it can't defend those normative values, then it will lose legitimacy as it seeks to go forward with a deepening process of integration. So yes, as someone mentioned before, the Future of Europe conference is very timely, but I think there are systemic issues which we knew existed before, but actually been made much more acute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I suppose the message to take from all of this is this time is different, or might possibly be different. So with that, I have to conclude the panel by thanking Danuta Hübner, Ivan Krastev, Sonja Puntscher-Riekmann, Loukas Tsoukalis, and Kevin Featherstone. And I hope those of you watching or listening enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.